Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com, and welcome to this series of short conversations about sacred name teachings and the Bibles that are inspired by them. We're going to be talking about 10 problems with sacred name Bibles and the teachings behind them in these conversations, and here's a welcome. This backstory to this discussion is that I'm doing a series reviewing Bible translations from Hebraic perspectives. This includes Orthodox and Messianic Jewish translations, and also Hebrew roots and sacred name versions. Sacred name versions, of course, are the ones that we're going to be talking about here. Before reviewing individual sacred name Bibles, though, I thought it would be helpful to give you a quick overview explaining what they are, where they came from, and some serious problems that they have in common. Now, before we start talking about this, I do want to say one thing. As you can see, I'm reading off of a text here, and this is so that we can be as efficient as possible. Maybe you don't want to just sit there listening to me talk around issues, so I'm reading off a text so that we can stick to the point and get the information across. And here's the great thing. If you're like super time efficient, and if you have a really active, maybe even hyperactive brain like me, you can even just hit the right hand button on your keyboard while you're watching this on the YouTube video, and it'll just skip ahead and you can just read the text instead of having to even listen to me talk. And we'll also have a text version of this available on our website. So just wanted to put that little note out there. Let's start by talking about the elephant in the room. This is an emotionally charged issue for many people. If you're Jewish and you've heard people trying to pronounce God's name, you probably felt like this. If you read from a sacred name Bible, you may feel like this. And like this. And like this. Now, I did just mention that I'm going to be talking about some problems with sacred name Bibles and teachings. I understand that might have made you feel like this. Maybe you feel a little apprehensive even watching this video, knowing I will be talking about some problems with sacred name Bibles. Maybe you feel like this. I mean, we all love the Father's set-apart name. We love Him. We love His holy language. We love His name. Maybe you're even feeling a little bit defensive right now. Touch not the sacred name. Or maybe you're even feeling a little bit like this. Maybe I'm the bad guy who just wants to take your sacred name Bible from you. If that's you, I understand you may feel a little threatened right now. I hope you can hear me out as we talk about sacred name teachings and translations and look at what the Word and history tell us about them. I'm like you. I deeply love the Father, and I have an overwhelming desire to know the Messiah and follow Him. That commitment has cost me dearly, and I'm sure you've paid a high price also. So maybe it would be helpful to share a little of my story first thing. I teach Hebrew, and my passion is helping people come closer to Yeshua through experiencing the Hebrew language and learning about the Jewish context of the Bible. I'm also very serious about reading the Word and just believing and doing what it says, even if that isn't mainstream or popular. Like when I first got involved with the Messianic Jewish movement about 15 years ago, it was because I'd read the Bible and come to the conclusions that God wasn't finished with Israel, and that in fact the best was yet to come, that Yeshua didn't do away with the law, and that the Torah is still valid today, and that if Jesus Christ was the same yesterday, today, and forever, then He was still Jewish. And learning about Judaism could maybe help me get to know Him better. So when I first became Messianic, I got a sacred name Bible because it had some Hebrew in it and I was learning Hebrew. I also read some sacred name books that left me convinced that we should follow what the Word says about calling on and proclaiming God's name, instead of following rabbinic traditions of men that would cause us to forget God's name. I even taught this in my first Hebrew course, where I read God's name as you can see it here, instead of following the Jewish tradition of saying Adonai. So as we talk about sacred name teachings, even though I no longer subscribe to them, I want you to know that I really care about these matters and that I have thought long and deep about them. There is another reason I really care about this topic. Sacred name teachings pretty much wrecked my life, honestly. They were very damaging to my relationships with my Christian friends and my ability to represent the Messianic message to them. They also distanced me from the Jewish community and negated the testimony for Yeshua I could have had. They did the opposite of helping me become a mature, healthy, and loving person. Maybe that was just me, but that was my experience. Sacred name teachings produced so much bad fruit in my life, seriously, that it literally took years to undo the damage they caused. I want to spare you that pain and that waste. Like, especially as a teacher, this is my effort at keeping you from going down a path that may look right, but it'll only take you downhill. So, having shared some of the backstory to these talks, let's continue. We'll just talk for a moment here about what are sacred name Bibles. To answer that question, we should probably answer the question of what's the sacred name. In the original Hebrew text of the Bible, God's name is written as these 4 letters, as you can see here, Yod, He, and Vav, He. One of the 10 commandments is to not take God's name in vain. And the punishment for taking God's name in vain was execution. It was actually a capital crime. So not surprisingly, the Jewish people have taken God's name very seriously and treated it with great reverence. Since before the time of Yeshua, one of the ways the Jewish people did this was by saying Adonai instead of actually pronouncing the sacred name. Adonai is Hebrew for master or Lord. Instead of saying God's name, Jewish people also say Hashem, which literally means the name. Interestingly enough, almost all Christian Bible translators have followed this Jewish tradition, and instead of trying to write the sacred name in English letters, have written the Lord instead. Or just Lord if you're addressing him. Here is a title page from an early version of the Bible translated into English. As you can see, this was done in 1611. And you can see here at the very top that it actually has the name of God written in Hebrew characters right there. And just in little tiny letters. So that's in contrast with Jewish and Christian tradition, sacred name Bibles attempt to put God's name into the translation. The reason I say attempt, and that's how the language I'm going to be using throughout these talks, is because it's not certain how God's name was actually pronounced. So almost every sacred name Bible has a different pronunciation. So you can't actually say the sacred name. All you can do is try to. You can attempt to, because no one is really sure exactly how it's pronounced. The most popular pronunciations are these here. There's at least one translation that avoids this problem by putting the original Hebrew, just the Hebrew Yod, He, and Vav, He, in the English text and then leaving it up to you to figure out how to pronounce it. Sacred name Bibles also use the Hebrew name of the Messiah, or some variant of it. Some of them have Yeshua, which is the normal Hebrew pronunciation. Others have their own versions, such as Yeshua, Yahushua, Yahusha, or Yahawashi. And you may be thinking this right now. I know this is pretty basic stuff, but you know, I want to make sure that we start out on the same foot, so to speak, and that we're on the same page with regards to what a sacred name Bible actually is. It's just a Bible that uses the sacred name, that has the sacred name written either in Hebrew in the otherwise English text, or as I mentioned more commonly, some variation or pronunciation of his name written in English letters. Now, there are other differences between sacred name Bibles and regular Bibles. I'll explain those differences in more detail in my individual reviews, which you can find on our website at holylanguage.com. Look under the resource section and you'll see translation reviews. But for now, this introduction should give you a rough idea of what sacred name Bibles are about. Now, let's talk about the teachings that inspired sacred name Bibles in the first place. What are sacred name teachings? Sacred name Bibles are based on sacred name teachings. Basically, these teachings say that you should try to pronounce God's sacred name instead of following the Jewish and Christian traditions of saying Adonai or Lord. I say try to pronounce his name because, remember, as I mentioned earlier, it's not certain how his name was originally pronounced. They also say that you should use the Hebrew name of the Messiah instead of Jesus or whatever he's called in your language. And you may be thinking this right now. Sacred name teachings teach you the sacred name. I'd never have guessed. All right, I know this is basic, but I think it's really good to define some terms here at the very beginning of this conversation. There are other sacred name teachings. For instance, they say that words like God and Jesus are actually dirty words, and that you shouldn't say them because they come from pagan languages. Of course, they use English to tell you this. I'll tackle some of those other teachings in my individual reviews, but for now, this should give you a good sense of what sacred name teachings have to say. So these are some of the sacred name Bibles that we will be reviewing in this series. And basically, in these little talks, discussing problems with sacred name teachings and sacred name Bibles. This is going to be an introduction, like an introductory overview of my individual reviews on some of these translations. And please do not go out and get these translations. I'm not suggesting that you should get them all for the sake of this discussion. Here are the 10 problems that we are going to be talking about in these discussions. Sacred name teachings, they don't follow Yeshua's example. They don't follow the example of Yeshua's apostles. They're based on misinterpretations of Scripture and misunderstanding of language. They make false accusations against both Jews and Christians. They cause unnecessary fights and divisions. They will destroy your witness to the Jewish community. They're a new form of replacement theology. They claim to be Messianic when they're not. And they breed unconscious anti-Semitism. And I know that's some heavy stuff right there. Please hang in there with me. And let's look at some of these things together. Look at what the scriptures have to say. How there's certain verses that are definitely relevant to sacred name claims. And we're also going to look at history, some untold history. So thanks for joining me in this introduction to these conversations about problems with sacred name teachings and the Bibles that are based on them. I can't wait to have you join me in our first little conversation talking about the example of our dear master, our holy Rabbi Yeshua of Nazareth. See you then.